So, what do you do with all this moral stuff? That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. So, we've just finished up this series on anthropology and ethics. And within that series, we walked through sort of a history of anthropology, looking at the ways in which various philosophies from ancient through modern understand the human person, and then examining the ways in which those different understandings play their way out in the area of moral philosophy or ethics. And then what we did is we did an episode on applied ethics, where we went ahead and we took samplings of various ethical models, and then we ran those topics through these different moral philosophies in order to show the ways in which how you see the world and man and ultimately morality ends up playing out and affecting applied ethics. And then we went ahead and we rounded out the series with a look at anthropology in the Christian East and the Christian West, contrasting those two different visions of man and world and God and how all of that relates to one another. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to offer a postscript on the question of morality and specifically applied ethics. Now, the big question that we're going to have to answer for regular listeners is, how does this affect the poly markets? Is this technically part of the anthropology and ethics series? Are we really up to yet another episode? Or not? Well, I'm going to have to leave that to you. But for myself, the main thing I'm interested here is weighing in on something that I've observed. I observed it actually within the comments. I saw something in there that is rather interesting with the way in which people respond or react to moral assessments of the kind I offered specifically in the episode on homosexuality, transgenderism, and abortion. What I observed is this. Let me actually start with a different story. So every now and then, I would offer a class. I did this at Calvin College, actually. I offered a class on objective aesthetics, and specifically a realist perspective. In other words, I would go into the philosophy of art and aesthetics and beauty. There actually is such a thing as art. It's not just a social construct. And to suggest the idea that there actually is such a thing as good and bad art, art that is superior and inferior. Now, one of the things that would happen whenever I would delve into a topic like this was I noticed a certain discomfort emerging with students. And why was that? Well, the reason was pretty obvious to me as an observer, which is that the students started to feel immediately, as they considered the possibility that there really is such a thing as good and bad art, superior and inferior, they started to have a sense that maybe, just maybe, this would have ramifications. In other words, maybe if it's true that my musical taste is actually inferior, that in some ways I prefer or I like things that are inferior to this other thing that I don't really like, maybe that's actually an indictment of my taste. It seemed obvious to them that they ought to like certain things more than others. Now, again, I never said this, but it was obvious to them that this means that there is such a thing as good and bad taste. And the good and bad taste seems to be whether or not one's taste conforms to reality, whether or not you do, in fact, like the superior over the inferior, or whether or not you like the inferior more than you ought. So suddenly it became intuitively obvious to them. If Bach is superior to K-pop or something like that, then it seems they ought to like Bach more. But what if they don't? Right? And that discomfort started to stir in them a need to push away that reality, because there was this sense in which they felt they needed to justify their own tastes. And if there is actually objective reality to the good and the bad of art and aesthetics and music and things like that, then it's hard to justify. The only way to justify their taste is actually to say that there is not good and bad, and it's all just taste. In that case, I'm off the hook. Now, I find this very interesting because you see the same thing happen in ethics. One of the things that begins to emerge is that people get very uncomfortable if a certain type of behavior they engage in or want to engage in or would like to engage in is suddenly indicted as morally impermissible. That becomes really difficult for them. And suddenly there is a need or a desire to rebut the ethical assessment. Now, why do I find this interesting? I find it interesting because it goes to something that I've observed in the past about just sort of the nature of the human mind. Amongst the many things that I talk about when I talk about realism, obviously, when I've brought up the topic of realism in the past, I always frame the topic, which anybody who listens to me regularly knows this. I always frame the topic by identifying certain default settings that are there in the mind. That when we look out into the world, we see and think in terms of genera and species and common properties. And then I frame this, of course, as the question of realism versus nominalism, is the question of whether or not those things the mind is identifying, whether those categories and properties and groups are real, which case realism, or whether those are just mental fictions that the mind invents and imposes on the world. Are they just names that we impose on the world? And if you say that, you're a nominalist. But one of the other things that's interesting is that this is far from the only sort of default setting, if you're going to use that, for the mind. One of the things that also emerges that I find very fascinating is the idea that when we look into the world, there's this intuitive understanding that the world ought to be just and it ought to be fair. C.S. Lewis, of course, observes this in his moral argument, where he talks about the fact that if you pay attention to how people interact, how they quarrel, it's interesting that human beings don't quarrel in the way that animals do. Animals fight, right? We have a conflict over something, it goes to blows. Whereas human beings reason with each other. And they reason with each other by pointing to certain rules that they presume you ought to know. I gave you some of mine, you should give me some of yours. Which is actually in some ways an appeal to some sort of rule, a moral mandate regarding fairness. And rather than saying, what are you even talking about? That's dumb. The person usually actually engages in a dialogue about the rule, and they try to offer an exception why, in this case, that rule doesn't apply. And this is the point that Lewis observes to say, that's rather interesting, isn't it? That human beings actually interact as moral beings who think in moral ways and interact with each other according to moral principles. And rather than people saying, I don't know what you're talking about, they actually interact and engage and defend themselves according to the very same rules that for some reason we all know. And that's how Lewis builds his moral argument. Well, one of the things along these same lines that I've talked about is the fact that it's very interesting that when tragedy happens, right, some great injustice happens, the natural default for a lot of people is to say, why? And they're not asking like causally why, like, okay, what's the laws of physics that, led, this car to flip over and kill somebody, right? It's not something like that. They're not asking a causal why. They're asking a cosmic why. They're asking why would this be permitted to happen within our world? And this is, of course, the root. This impulse is the root of the problem of evil, where people are really asking, why would God allow this? Now, one of the reasons I think that's so interesting is because it indicates that people intuitively are not only aware of the concept of fairness or of justice, but they actually believe that the world ought to be just and fair. And that's why they're asking why, right? Why is this thing allowed to transpire here in this cosmos? Now, I find that particularly odd for a couple of reasons. The one is because from an empiricist perspective, it's hard to justify. How is it, if all of our concepts emerge out of empirical experience, how is it that anybody would ever, within a world that is clearly not just and fair, arrive at a concept of justice and fairness? And certainly, parents can't be blamed for the concept of instilling fairness or justice. If parents have taught us anything, it's that the world is not fair. That's one of the lessons you need to learn. What about religion? Well, religion doesn't teach you that the world ought to be just and fair. In fact, it asks the question, why is it that the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? So where would this notion come from? Because it seems to be there as a default setting within the human mind that we just know the world ought to be a certain way. And yet, experience, parents, religion all tells us it's not that way. So where does the concept come from? And I don't think we can identify it as merely some type of wish fulfillment, as if we were saying, well, we wish the world was a certain way, and this is just a universal wish that people harbor. Because one of the things that happens is that the impulse or the intuition that says it's supposed to be just actually works reflectively against us, so that when we engage in some form of injustice, we feel a need to justify ourselves. And this again tells us something that's very interesting about the human mind. The human mind is incapable of coping with the idea that the world is unjust. It's why the problem of evil has such potency. And it's also one of the reasons why we have to justify our own behaviors, that when we are the ones that commit injustice, we feel a need to explain how our deed isn't unjust, how ours is an exception. There's certain circumstantial reasons why this exception to the rule applies to us, or why it's easily justified if you understood the circumstance or the conditions under which I did this thing.
Hello, listeners. I have some exciting news to share with you today. I am thrilled to announce the launch of Jacob's Premium. And of course, you had to be the first to know. I wanted to make this the most valuable membership possible. So you'll find options with my Orthodox Foundations lecture series, Modern Philosophy lecture series, my film Becoming Truly Human, and so much more. And that really is just the beginning. Within a few months, there will be hundreds of hours of exclusive theology and philosophy-rich content. I'll also be adding a few live elements going forward. The first is a members-only live stream Q&A. And later on in the show, I'm going to tell you about the project I'm most excited about, my new live book club, the Scholé Society. I truly wanted to make this the most valuable subscription possible for you, my listeners. So head over to the NathanJacobsPodcast.com and sign up today for Jacob's Premium.
Now, why do I find that so interesting? I find it interesting because the very impulse to grow uncomfortable with ethical assessments that offer conclusions that we don't like lead a person not to say, well, be damned with ethics. Rather, there's a need to dispel the ethical judgment. That's what I find so interesting. So I find it interesting that when somebody sees that there is a moral assessment that says perhaps homosexuality is wrong, or perhaps this other type of behavior that I would like to engage in is wrong, rather than just saying, okay, it's wrong, but who cares? I'm going to do it anyway. Instead, they feel a need to try to dispel the conclusion. And why? I think it has the same root as the need to justify our actions. That the human mind, knowing that the world is supposed to be just and fair, has a very difficult time accepting that I am the reason the world is unjust and unfair. And so for that reason, moving into a mode of behavior that is evidently wrong usually requires a certain amount of self-justification in order to do that. And it's one of the reasons why people grow very uncomfortable with ethical assessments like the kind that I offered that suggest that a certain behavior that they want to engage in might be wrong. Because rather than just saying, okay, it's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway, they actually feel a need to justify the action and say, no, it's not really wrong. Because there is this hang up within the mind that says the world ought to be a certain way. It ought to be just. It ought to be fair. And for that reason, it struggles to accept that the course of action I'm going to engage in is going to be the reason it is actually unjust. I'm going to be the reason the world has been set off its axis. I find it interesting that people who were uncomfortable with the assessment of, say, natural law or deontology or something like that really wanted me to offer the assessment that says, yes, but that's why those are incorrect and you shouldn't listen to those ethical systems, as opposed to letting those ethical systems speak for themselves and offer their assessment, and you are left with the question of whether or not they're right, which is what I actually did in that context. Now, one of the things that this raises for me, and I wanted to flesh out a certain set of distinctions that we didn't touch on, but that I think is particularly relevant when exploring the area of ethics, because I think there is a natural tendency for a lot of people who have never looked at moral philosophy or engaged in formal ethical assessments to presume certain ramifications that might not be there. And so, what I wanted to do is I wanted to separate out sort of the question, the moral question of philosophy, the type of ethical question that I laid out in that episode, from, say, the political question, what the political ramifications of an ethical assessment might be, as well as from, I'll call it pastoral or the practical or something like that. The question of, well, what do you do with that on a personal level? Because I think all three of those things are different. And in case some people are hearing an ethical assessment for the first time and they've never engaged in ethics and they're thinking, what do I do with this? Well, let me help you think through what to do with this by actually separating these different topics. So let's begin with just moral philosophy generally, what we might call the sort of global moral assessment of a topic. This is definitely the sort of thing we've been engaged in throughout this series on anthropology and ethics. Did I just say this series? I guess I just wrapped this into the series. Anyway, now, one of the things that I would point out here is I actually think it is a bad idea to begin your assessment of ethics and moral philosophy from the perspective of this one particular issue. And here's why. When I went on my philosophical and religious journey, which you can read about in my essay, Becoming Orthodox, is that what it's called? And then I also have a series here on the podcast called My Wild Ride to Orthodoxy, which is basically me just reading that essay. And so you could take a look at that. But for those of you who aren't familiar with my journey to becoming an Eastern Orthodox philosopher, it was years and years and years, a couple of decades of me delving deeply into the history of ideas and going down all sorts of different rabbit trails, I never know. Anyway, going down all sorts of different rabbit holes and exploring different philosophical systems, religion, and all the rest. And I won't rehash that here because you can, again, listen to my wild ride to orthodoxy in order to get a sense of the whole. But along the way, one of the things that I engaged in was a good deal of self-doubt. And by self-doubt, maybe it would be better to say rather than doubt, self-suspicion. What I recognized was the danger of confirmation bias. In other words, I knew that it was all too easy for somebody to say, I want this thing to be true, and so I'm going to find a way to make sure that it's true. I'm going to grab hold of the evidence that supports this conclusion. And I didn't want to do that because I was really genuinely interested in truth. I thought the stakes were too high. I'd come to, for reasons that I talk about in that series, I had become deeply attuned to the fact that I would die one day. I came to see religious questions and the question about God and humanity and what happens after you die and all the rest as the most important questions that I could ask. And I saw the stakes as extraordinarily high. And for that reason, I wasn't interested in delusion. I was interested in truth. What's actually true? And for that reason, when I engaged in investigations of different topics in philosophy and in religion, I attended to what I wanted to be the case. I looked at myself and I said, what is the answer I would like to get? And then for that reason, I would spend a great deal of time entertaining the possibility that I found least appealing. So, for example, people who listen to me, they obviously know that I am a full-throated advocate of libertarian free choice and that I do not believe in determinism. But I, for a period of time, strongly entertained the possibility of determinism precisely because I thought, obviously, I want free will to be the case. I don't want to be a determined meat robot, but maybe I am. And I spent time sitting with that possibility and genuinely entertaining it. I didn't want to believe that God was a moral monster, but I thought maybe he is. And I really should entertain that possibility. And I did. I lived with that possibility for a very long time. I didn't want to believe in fate. I wanted to believe that I actually had some say in shaping my own destiny. But I entertained the possibility. Maybe I am fated. And so that was an important part of my intellectual journey. It was one of the ways in which I became so accustomed to different philosophical systems and became capable of stepping into those systems and treating them in a sympathetic way, which I hope that people who listen to me and read me understand that I try to give a fair shake to systems of thought that I disagree with. For example, I'll give you one very clear example: Immanuel Kant. People who know my work know that I am, well, at least many people think of me as, I don't think of me as, but many people think of me as a Kant scholar, because my first book was on Immanuel Kant in defense of Kant's religion, which I co-authored with Chris Firestone. And that book was nominated for the American Philosophical Association's Book of the Year. It's credited by a great many Kant scholars for changing the field of Kant studies, specifically with regard to his philosophy of religion. And so a lot of folks who have read me, and they've read either that book or they've read subsequent work that I've done on Kant, they presume he's a Kantian. And I find that comical, because there are a few people that I think are more wrong than Immanuel Kant. And since publishing In Defense of Kant's Religion, I've published other articles where I've offered my assessment of Kant, and it's quite clear that I don't think Kant is correct. I'm not a Kantian. And I've said that explicitly. And yet, people who haven't read those articles and have only read my published works about Kant, they tend to presume I'm a Kantian because I treat him very sympathetically. I mean, the book was called In Defense of Kant's Religion. And I made clear in the book, Chris and I made clear in the book, we're not defending Kant in the sense of saying he's right. We're just defending his coherence of what he's saying. At the end of the day, we withheld any judgment about whether or not what he was saying was true or false. Spoiler alert. I think it's false. But nonetheless, I think Kant is coherent. And so I say all that to say that for me, it was a deeply important feature of my intellectual integrity and intellectual journey to treat various systems of thought and various possibilities that I disagreed with a great deal of consideration to make sure that I wasn't engaged in confirmation bias. I say all that because I think it's really important that whenever somebody engages in some sort of intellectual journey, that they attend to their own biases, that they attend to the sorts of things that they know deep down, if they're honest, that they want to be true. And they deal with those sorts of wants with a certain amount of suspicion. And so for that reason, that's one of the reasons I would never recommend that somebody begins to build their worldview by starting with some, sacred cow that they have, right? There's something in particular that's the center of my world. Let's say I'm a pickup expert and I love, promiscuous sex. And there's no world, if I were honest with you, I'm like, look, I am not going to get married. I'm certainly not going to be celibate. And so that's the thing. Like, I am not interested in any worldview that's going to suggest that I should do those things and that I should abandon this lifestyle that I have. The last thing you should do is go ahead and make an assessment of worldview based on that question. To start with that is to set yourself up for confirmation bias. Rather, the better approach is to take that thing and set it to one side and bracket it and acknowledge, look, of course, I would like to continue to live in this way. I don't want to give that thing up. Heaven forbid that my conclusions lead me there. But I'm going to, because it's so intoxicating for me, because it is the sort of thing that is going to cause a certain haze over my eyes and lead me toward a certain bias in investigation, I'm actually not going to start with the ethical question about that thing. I'm going to bracket it. And instead, I'm going to go down to level 4 issues. So you'll recall that I've talked about this before, right? These 4 levels of discourse, where you have sort of meme culture, which is the most superficial, right? And it's a child, not a choice. And then you have this second level where you go down to applied ethics, and you start to talk more about your level 1 sort of commitments, and you're using more words, but you're not really talking about, the underlying worldview. You're just sort of asserting the premises with greater depth. I think this is a human being. I don't think the birth canal changes that fact. And so for that reason, I think this is just murder and you shouldn't do it, right? But you haven't really talked about what do you mean by good and evil, right and wrong, and what makes things good and evil, right and wrong, and how do we discern those sorts of things? To do that, you need to go down to this third level of discourse, where now you're starting to ask questions about, well, what do I mean by good and evil, right and wrong? Do I mean pleasant and painful, or do I mean something ontological having to do with the order of nature? And then how do I discern those sorts of things? What's the basis for good and evil, right and wrong? How do I discern good and evil, right and wrong? And then beneath that, you go down to these metaphysical levels, right? The nature of reality itself. Is there a God? Is there not? Is it providentially ordered? Is it not? And I really would not advise that anybody, when dealing with an ethical question, that they start with either level 2 or even level 3 necessarily. Because as I've talked about in the past, metaethics is an outgrowth of metaphysics. And that's one of the reasons why, when talking about anthropology, I started with anthropology. I started with the understanding of the world and the understanding of man in order to show how those level 4 issues end up unfold into a certain metaethic, into a certain understanding of what it means to say something is good or evil, right or wrong, and what, in fact, that's rooted in. So what I would actually recommend, the proper order of procedure I think anybody should engage in, is actually not beginning with applied ethics, but rather with those level 4 issues. Asking those questions procedurally, the best thing to do is to start with a question of something like realism and nominalism. Do I actually think my faculties are oriented toward telling me true things about the world? If I think that, does that mean I'm naturally a realist? Or can I actually justify nominalism? If I've gone the route of realism, what are the ramifications? Does that mean that the world is ordered by something like a mind and now I'm into some form of theism? Right? Those sorts of questions that I think ultimately serve as the foundation for then the ethical questions. What is the ramification of this underlying worldview for when we talk about morality? And once you build from there, you're now in a position to actually then finally, after you've come to some sound conclusions, if you've been honest, to bring out that sacred cow and say, what does it have to say about this? Like, can I continue to live this way and be promiscuous or not? And so I don't think the right place to start is actually with some level 2 or level 3 issue having to do with this is the thing that I hold on to. I don't think that's the right way to approach it, because it's a recipe for going ahead and coming to conclusions that are just a form of confirmation bias. Because as I said, we have a very difficult time coming to grips with the idea that we're engaged in immoral or unjust behavior. Now, Peter Berger, his work is in the area of sociology, and Rumors of Angels is actually a dated book. He makes some point, I think in there he references, at some point the Vietnam War will be over. You're like, okay, this is an old book. So, but the book, what it actually has to say, I think, continues to be relevant. Berger had focused on this phenomena of being a cognitive minority. It observed in terms of human behavior, one of the things that becomes very clear is that human beings, being not just rational animals, but social animals, have a tendency to link what we think to what everybody knows to be true. A lot of our beliefs are formulated by gathering from the people around us what most people understand to be the case. And in addition to that, one of the things that occurs because we are social animals, we find it actually very dangerous or uncomfortable to be in the cognitive minority. So if, for example, everybody knows that, and then fill in the blank, vaccines don't work, right? Or vaccines do work, whatever it might be, then it becomes a very uncomfortable thing for us to dissent. And this is what creates the experience of being a cognitive minority. And what Berger observes is that because we are social animals, what kicks in the face of discovering that you are in the minority is a crisis of belief. Now, he suggests that this crisis of belief, realizing that you are at odds with the majority, ends up forcing a choice. And it goes in only one of 3 directions. The one is that you end up relinquishing the belief and saying, oh, everybody knows that. I don't want to be the idiot who's wrong about this. And you just go along with what everybody knows. And you trade in your belief for whatever the belief of the majority is. The second possibility is that you retain the belief for whatever reason, but you hide it, right? I'm not going to let everybody know that I disagree with the majority. I think this is still true, but I wouldn't want to put myself in danger by going ahead and being vocal about the fact that I hold to this minority view. And then the third possibility is that I actually am vocal about it and I try to proselytize others and persuade them that I am correct. Now, the thing is, for obvious reasons, that third possibility is the least likely. And very few people do that. Why? Well, because you would have to have a certain amount of courage or at least bullheadedness in order to do that sort of thing. And the fight or flight instinct actually moves more naturally toward a protective posture, which is going to mean that the safer thing is either to hide your dissent from the majority or to abandon your dissent from the majority. Now, the reason this is particularly relevant is because when talking about this, Berger talks about the tendency amongst anthropologists to go native. And what he means by that is he talks about this phenomenon amongst anthropologists who would go out into the field, right? They'd go find some indigenous tribe off wherever, and they would go ahead and live with them and study them. And what he noticed, what he observed, is that anthropologists have a tendency, quite frequently, to go native, meaning being the minority view within the indigenous population. In other words, anthropologists who go out and they study indigenous populations find themselves immediately in the cognitive minority. And because they're in the cognitive minority, they experience a crisis of belief from realizing that their views diverge from the broader population. And for that reason, what Berger observes is that many anthropologists will face a temptation, if not actually follow through on it, to go native, meaning abandon their beliefs for the beliefs of the population they're among. Now, why does Berger point this out? Well, the reason is because when trying to explain to people what it's like to have a crisis of belief, he talks about this possibility that you're from a certain place, a certain country, a certain tribe, whatever it might be, where it's a firmly held belief that the stars determine your fate. And then you arrive on the shores of the United States and you start to discover that nobody thinks that and everybody thinks you're crazy. You would have a crisis of belief from being in the cognitive minority. And Berger points out that you might listen to that and say, well, of course you would, and you should, because it's dumb to think that the stars determine your fate. Berger points out that if we flip the situation, we take you and we transplant you to a culture where everybody knows that the stars determine their fate, you too will experience a crisis of belief in the opposite direction. And the experience of anthropologists he points to as a clear example of this. You're talking about educated Westerners who are going into other populations and they're experiencing that same crisis of belief arising out of being a cognitive minority. So what are we to make of this, right? Is the lesson that, well, I guess all of our beliefs are just socially determined? No. Berger's point is actually, this is the reason why you need to actually examine your beliefs and let reason have its say. In other words, he's pointing out something that is talked about by somebody like William James. So William James, in his work, The Will to Believe, he talks about this fact that there are certain just live and dead options. That if I come to you and I start to tell you certain things are true or false, some of those things are going to ring as true, and you're going to consider them and say, oh, yeah, maybe so. And some of them are just going to land flat with you. You're going to be like, no way. And James points out that we have a tendency to think of those reflexive reactions as in some ways rational. They're actually not. They're pre-rational. And when you bring together this point from James and this point from Peter Berger, what you start to see is exactly why that is. That many of the things that we just know to be true, many of the things that we default to and say, yes, obviously true, obviously so, obviously false, are actually not based on reason. They're based on other things such as what our surrounding culture knows to be true. And for that reason, Peter Berger thinks it's important that we look on those sort of cultural leanings with a certain amount of suspicion. That the things that we've gathered from culture that just says, well, obviously this is right, and obviously this is wrong, obviously this is good, this is bad, obviously this is true, this is false, the things that everybody knows, we actually should recognize that there's something about our embrace of those that is actually not rational. It's pre-rational, it's animal, it's social. And for that reason, we should eye those things with a certain amount of suspicion and allow reason to have its say. And I think that's quite important to recognize that in many ways, when you're engaging in ethics, it's very tempting to do something that I talked about a certain student that I had doing. So you remember when I talked about trans, if you've listened to that episode, and I talked about a girl who was doing a presentation on trans. And in keeping with the parameters of the assignment, she had to take trans and assess it according to a consequentialist model and then sort of an objectivist natural law type model. And what she struggled with was how to assess it under natural law. And it wasn't really a struggle over how to apply natural law. The struggle was that she saw quite clearly that natural law would condemn it as immoral. And I say that in order to say that I think this is a very good reason why when we're engaging in this sort of discourse, it's important to go down to those level 4 issues and not begin with the outcomes that we know to be true, because much of what Peter Berger is talking about actually lives at that level 1 and level 2. It lives in the world of applied ethics. The majority of people in our culture truthfully walk around saying, like, this is good and this is bad, this is right and this is wrong, without ever giving a thought to what they mean by the terms right and wrong, without ever giving a thought to the reason why this thing that they think is wrong is wrong. And those are all level 3 issues that very few people bother to dig down to. But as I've tried to show here on this podcast, oftentimes it is important to go down to those level 3 and level 4 issues. And for that reason, I think, given that I think it's advisable to be suspicious of ourselves, of the things that we want to be so, of the things that we just know to be so from our culture, I think it's important to actually dig down to those level 4 issues and begin with those bigger questions. Set aside our own sacred cows, and just let the investigation into these questions like realism or nominalism, into questions like whether the world is ordered by something like providence or not. And then from there, questions of good and evil, right and wrong, and let those questions play out and have their say, and only then bring them to bear on what it means for us and how we live. And I think this is an important thing to understand actually about ancient philosophy in general. I think I've probably talked about this in this podcast, but in case I haven't, I'll repeat it. The fact of the matter is that when it comes to ancient philosophy, ancient pagan philosophers were really asking the question, how should I live? Right? The question that they ultimately had was a question about what is the good life? How is it that I should live? And they recognized that in order to answer that question, they actually had to start with deeper questions. They had to start with questions about the world itself. Is the world rational or is it irrational? If it is rational and it's ordered by something like a mind, then what is my place within the world? And what does that tell me about how I ought to live? And they began with those sorts of broader questions in order to get to the answer. What does a good life look like? And I do think that that's the right way to go about it. You don't start with what you want to be so. You don't start with the things that you want to hold on to. You start with the bigger questions, and you allow truth and reason and wisdom to have its say. And wherever it leads, then you can begin to assess what it means for you personally on an individual level. And that's actually why, in this context, I wanted to separate out these sort of private or the personal or the pastoral or the practical question of what do you do with ethics for you personally from the broader question of ethics. How do you come to an ethical system and begin to apply it, which is the sort of thing I did in that episode. I think it's important to differentiate those issues. I say differentiate as opposed to separate, because obviously what you end up concluding about the world and about ethics is going to have ramifications for you and for how you live. But I don't think you begin with looking at your life and saying, well, what are the things I want to hold on to? I think it begins actually with asking honest questions about the nature of the world, about the nature of man, about the nature of right and wrong. And only when those questions begin to point to certain answers can you begin to assess the ramifications for you personally. Now, I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to do it aside before I get there on the question of politics.
Skole, a word that means leisure devoted to learning. I'm launching the Skole Society, my new book club, where we'll meet live for 2 hours each month. For our first year together, we're diving deep into select works of C.S. Lewis, starting with one of his classic works, Mere Christianity. Many of you may be familiar with Lewis's works, but what you may not be familiar with is just how steeped in Eastern patristic thought Lewis was. And that includes his claims in Mere Christianity. Here's something special for our early supporters. The first 100 people to sign up at the NathanJacobspodcast.com can use promo code LEWIS, that's LEWIS, to reduce your membership by $10 per month. The Skole Society, a year with Lewis. It's part of Jacob's Premium, and you can join us at the NathanJacobspodcast.com. That's the NathanJacobspodcast.com.
Now, I don't think of this podcast as particularly political. We talk here about philosophy and we talk about religion. And obviously, issues of philosophy and religion have ramifications for politics. That's certainly true. But I think one of the mistakes that sometimes people will make is that they presume that making an assessment, offering an ethical assessment that says that this thing is immoral, has a direct through line or implication that says, therefore, it should be illegal. Obviously, that doesn't follow. There are plenty of things that are immoral that are perfectly legal. In order to answer that question, you'd actually have to get into an entirely different set of questions, such as what is the nature of government? What is the role of government? What is the purpose of laws? And so on, including how does morality and law relate to one another. But I bring this up and I make that caveat specifically because I think sometimes, given the nature of our culture and the sort of heated nature of contemporary the culture wars, there's a tendency to knee-jerk react to an ethical assessment of a certain issue, like abortion or trans or homosexuality, like I did, and presume that there is a natural implication for the politics of it, as opposed to allowing the ethical assessment to be what it is. And I call this out for the very same reason I called out personal bias and social biases. Because if the tendency is to say, I want to vote in a certain way, or I don't want to vote in a certain way, and therefore I don't want to offer any quarter, like no quarter to any position that might favor those crazies that I'm on the other side of, then there is a temptation to offer a dishonest assessment of the issue. And so just like when I talk about viewing ourselves with certain suspicions and things that we want to be true and want to be false, or talking about our social biases or things like that, I think the political biases are also the sort of thing that should be on that list of something that needs to be viewed with suspicion and put in check when offering the ethical assessment. Because, as I said, the tendency is to presume that if the ethics come down in a certain way, there is necessarily a certain political entailment. And that's not necessarily so. I'm not going to suggest that ethics is totally irrelevant to politics, but I am going to suggest that it doesn't immediately follow that because something is unethical or immoral, that therefore it should be illegal. That goes to a different aspect of philosophy, such as what is the role of government, what are the roles of law, and how do morality and laws relate one to another. Okay, now let's return to the question of personal ethics. And this one, I think, is, it moves almost into the pastoral, but let me offer a very clear caveat here. I am no one's pastor. I am no one's priest. I am also not a representative of the Orthodox Church. I am a philosopher and a theologian. I'm a scholar. And yes, my philosophical and religious journey led me to Eastern Orthodoxy, so I am an Orthodox Christian philosopher. So I speak often, not just about the history of ideas, but also about the Eastern Church Fathers and things like that. So if you're looking for pastoral advice, you're looking in the wrong place if you're looking to me, because I am nobody's pastor and I am nobody's priest. But what I am is a fellow pilgrim on the moral journey and on the spiritual journey. So that's what I want to speak about. I think there is a tendency for a lot of folks, especially young folks, that when they begin to ask certain questions about the world and about morality, to have a certain amount of zeal that says, okay, I now know how I'm supposed to live and I'm going to go do it. And I actually think that's great. I think when that sort of enthusiasm is properly directed, it can be a very good thing. But it can also be a very debilitating thing if the road that they set their sights on is grueling. I recognize that when it comes to morality and spirituality and offering the sorts of assessments that I did, that there is a tendency to move straight to the personal application, just like in the case of my students who hear about objective aesthetics and begin to immediately evaluate themselves and assess the ramifications. And inevitably, it begins to happen that when people hear moral and ethical assessments, one of the things they're hearing is what it means for me personally. So if we're touching on something that has to do with my own personal choices, my own personal life, they recognize intuitively this has ramifications and they make that next step. And sometimes those choices, if taken in total, feel very overwhelming. So let's just take as a hypothetical that I were somebody who is sexually attracted to other men. I'm not. I don't struggle with that. I struggle with a lot of things. That's not one of them. But let's just pretend for a moment that I do. If I then started to walk through an assessment of what it means to be a realist, to come to a certain conclusion about natural law, to play that out and realize that where this is headed is that homosexuality is immoral and morally impermissible, and I had a desire to be virtuous, all of a sudden, I would very quickly play that out. And the immediate place my mind would go would be to say, I'm never going to be allowed to have sexual intimacy or companionship or love again. The idea that I could ever sort of nurture a heterosexual impulse sounds impossible in this moment of where I'm standing right now. And so this sounds like a death sentence because the main thing that I want right now is I want companionship and I do want love and I do love sexual intimacy. And now what is the ramification? And I would immediately race to the end of the line, and it would feel overwhelming. And I think that there's something detrimental about approaching ethics in that way. I don't mean to say that ethics is wrong, but what I do mean to say is that there is wisdom in the observation of Aristotle that virtue is formed over time through habit and repetition of choices. There is wisdom to the idea of becoming a moral and upright and virtuous person one step at a time. As Origen points out, there is no such thing as punctuated virtue. This is very much in keeping with the Eastern Church Fathers, the idea that we have to be formed over time. And one of the things that I observe within the Eastern Church Fathers, in the Desert Fathers, right, the most radical spiritual ascetics that there are, who like leave the world, sell all they have, and go out into the desert in order to pursue God and put to death the deeds of the flesh and so on, even they, when spiritual pilgrims will come to them, they will give them instruction and they'll say, do this, right? And they'll appeal to some sort of, teaching of Christ. And people will actually say to them, I can't do that. And they say, okay, how about this? And they actually will meet people where they're at. Say, okay, if you can't do that, how about this? Okay, if you can't do that, how about this? And they recognize the very real possibility of a person taking incremental steps toward virtue. These same Eastern Fathers, look at St. Anthony. They recognize that it is possible to overburden and break a person because they are not yet at a place where they can accept or swallow certain things. And I don't say this in order to whitewash morality. I can anticipate that a lot of people will hear this and they'll immediately say, so are we supposed to just make moral concessions? We're supposed to just make room for immorality? I'm not saying that at all. What I'm acknowledging is that a sober and wise approach to Virtue acknowledges that it is something acquired over a lifetime and that it is something that you have approached one step at a time, just like if you were learning to play the piano or you were learning to sculpt or to paint. And I think for that reason, there's a real danger of trying to eat the whole elephant, as it were. If you've ever heard this phrase, right? How is it that you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? And the whole point of the phrase is, and this is a lesson that I've had to learn for myself, that there's a real danger when undertaking a massive task of looking at the whole of the task. And the reason is because when you look at the whole of the task, something that should take place over the course of years, it looks impossible. There is no world where I could actually do this. And yet, if you look at the first step, that's doable. And the second step, that's doable. And before you know it, if you just put one foot in front of the other, or running with our metaphor, one bite and then another, eventually you'll eat the whole elephant. And you can look back and be surprised to find you actually did it. And I think morality is exactly the same way. There's a tendency for a lot of people that when they become convinced of a certain way of living, they want to treat it like a light switch. Tomorrow I am starting and I am done with everything from my past life and I am a new person. And then for that reason, whenever they stumble or they fall, there's a temptation to despair, as if they thought that you should be able to just wake up and say, I'm a new person. But it just doesn't work that way. That is not how virtue is attained. And you can see this if you look at the wisdom of the Eastern Fathers. The Eastern Fathers regularly talk about trials and struggles and pain and suffering as the fires that make you into a saint. And why? Because it's very easy to perceive yourself as being patient when nothing annoys you. But when you're suddenly thrust into a situation with really annoying things, that's where you find out whether or not you're patient. And if you're not, that's your opportunity to begin to cultivate patience. Because, as we've talked about in the context of virtue, courage is actually something that is cultivated. Cowardice is an absence. Courage is the thing cultivated, is a positive reality, something that you have to go after and grow and cultivate like strength, like building a muscle. This is the wisdom of the saints, that they recognize this very fact, that how we cultivate patience is not that we just decide suddenly that we're going to be a patient person. It's that we have to rub up against things that require us to cultivate patience. We have to choose it. When we lack faith, we have to run up against circumstances that force us to put our faith in God. When we want to cultivate courage, we have to face things that are terrifying. And that's actually the only way in which those virtues are cultivated. One of the things that I've pointed out in the past, I actually remember pointing this out once to my girls, my daughters, when they were much younger, and we had gone to a presentation put on by basically a crisis pregnancy center. And one of the things I talked about in that context is that the clearest avenue to your salvation, to your growth, is whatever is nearest and hardest. So, of course, here I'm speaking as an Eastern Orthodox person. When I say your salvation, I'm talking about actually being deified, transformed, conformed to the image of Christ. I'm not talking about just trusting Jesus to forgive your sins. But when you consider what the refining fires are that God utilizes in order to conform you to the image of Christ, the answer is typically whatever is nearest and hardest. And so I shared this with my girls in order to point out, for example, when we find ourselves in crisis, for example, a young girl who is pregnant, she's made some bad choices, and now she's pregnant. The very real temptation for us is to try to figure out, how do we remove the crisis and get back to the life that we want and that we intend, and just do an end around the problem. And yet, the path to virtue is actually typically leaning into that crisis. If a person can shift perspective, for example, and say, okay, I realize this wasn't the plan. I wanted to grow up and I wanted to go to college and I wanted to fall in love and then I wanted to marry my sweetheart out of college and then I wanted us to get a house and so on and so forth. And this disrupts that. You could look at that and say, that's something I'm going to try to hold on to. And it doesn't matter what the collateral damage is because that's the highest good. Or you could say, I realize this was not the plan. And I realize this is a wake-up call that I've made some bad choices. But this is actually my opportunity to grow into a mature human being who engages in some form of self-sacrifice, genuine love for another person. And through this, if I actually embrace it, I might find that I grow into a virtuous human being. And that's the reality of it. The hardest things in our lives are either things that we try to avoid and diverge from and find the quickest exit route from, or they can be things that we look at as the refining fires that become the pathway to virtue. And ultimately, if you're speaking as an Orthodox Christian like I would, to salvation. And I say that because I think one of the dangers with ethical conversations is that the human being feels like their humanity and the frailty of their humanity has been lost in the discussion. In other words, ethics comes in with a cold, candid assessment. And the real question the person wants to ask is, but what do I do with that? What if I can't do that? And it's a very human, vulnerable question. And it's a worthwhile question. Now, I would never say that the answer to that question is we should throw out ethics, because I'm a firm believer that good and evil, right and wrong, morality is very important to answering the question, how ought we to live? But what I would say is that the full ethical assessment of what man is made to become is a whole elephant, and it needs to be eaten one bite at a time. And every person then becomes an individual case of how do you begin? This is why I think it's important that when people would go out into the desert and they would find Abba Antony or whoever it might be, and they would say, what must I do to be saved? And they would offer advice. And the response would come back, I don't think I can do that. But they didn't say, well, then you're damned. Instead, they would try to find out, what can you do? In other words, they recognized that you need to begin somewhere, and that it is best that a person starts somewhere than to not move forward toward virtue at all. This is one of the reasons why I would always recommend that when it comes to the desire for the virtuous life, if a person looks at the moral assessment, they look at their own struggle, they look at their own circumstance, and they are overwhelmed by the elephant of it, that the most important thing is actually find an appropriate spiritual father, an appropriate spiritual mother, someone who can offer some sort of guidance, who recognizes your humanity and is able to help you take one step at a time. I shared a story in my interview with Adam Dell where I talked about this drunken monk, right? This monk who had come to this monastery, and he was a raging alcoholic, and it was an embarrassment to the monastic community. And this abbot took him under his wing, and then at the funeral of this monk, the abbot offered a homily. He spoke about this monk, and he said he was a very good monk, very obedient. This was shocking to the other monks that were there, and he explained the reason, the backstory, why this man was such a raging alcoholic, which was actually due to his infancy and how he was raised in a worn-torn area where he was fed alcohol on a regular basis in order to keep him silent. And so for that reason, for all of his life, he had been an alcoholic before he could even remember making a choice to drink alcohol. And this abbot talked about how, as an act of obedience, he would offer to this monk the obedience of drinking one less shots or beer or whatever it was per day. And then next, the abbot asked him to again drink one less. And next, drink one less. And he talked about the fact that even though this monk was still drunk every day, by the time he reposed, he had greatly reduced the amount that he drank, and he was a very obedient monk. Funny thing is, when I shared this story with Adam Dell, he talked about the very fact that before ever hearing that story, he, as somebody who worked in a counseling psychology setting, had dealt with a very similar situation. Somebody who had drunk, I think he said something like 19 shots of vodka a day, and he had done something very similar. And it led to this man ultimately being sober. Now, the reason I bring that up is because sometimes there are certain situations in which, morally speaking, the whole elephant, in this case being stone cold sober tomorrow, might not actually be step number one. And this abbot had the wisdom to recognize that what this monk needed was not that, but something incremental. And I say that in order to say that sometimes when approaching certain vices, sometimes when approaching certain changes of life, sometimes, the answer is not cold turkey. Yes, there may be times where certain forms of immorality, certain vices that we have, certain people may be able to just pull the Band-Aid off. And step number one is, I'm done with it. And if you can do that, great. But sometimes, in certain circumstances, that's not step number one. Now, I will also add here, I think wisdom dictates that we are not always our best physicians. And that's one of the reasons why, throughout all of church history, there were priests and spiritual fathers and spiritual mothers to help shepherd people along the way toward virtue. And so I say this in order to say, if someone listening is overwhelmed by just the moral realities of a certain assessment, and they feel that pull that says, okay, now I need to live differently, but I'm scared to, or I'm terrified of what the ramifications are, or I'm afraid to lose this thing, or I'm afraid of what that means for the rest of my life, then maybe the best response is not to take in the whole elephant. Maybe the best response is to say, what does a step toward that begin to look like? And as I said, I think in an ideal world, you would actually have a spiritual guide to help walk you through that so that step by step, you can begin to move toward the virtuous life. So with that, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.